Given that Square Enix have chosen to remake Final Fantasy VII over multiple installments, each of which is going to be a full-length game, we always knew that they'd be making quite a few changes to the story, and they've certainly done so. Even though Final Fantasy VII Remake only covers the Midgar section of the original game, which is essentially 5 to 6 hours, there's still a lot of narrative additions, changes, and expansions to speak of. So here, we're going to talk about 15 such changes. This should go without saying, but there are major spoilers ahead for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, so if you haven't finished it, turn back now. Alright, let's kick things off, and let's begin with a relatively smaller one. Nibelheim Flashback. Throughout Final Fantasy VII Remake, Cloud, much like in the original, keeps having sudden flashes of headaches. Early on in the game, before he meets Aerith, Cloud starts hallucinating and seeing Sephiroth, something that happens quite a lot throughout the game, and these hallucinations trigger a flashback. Cloud briefly remembers Sephiroth's attack on Nibelheim, and though this is, of course, not a new story element by any stretch of the imagination, the stuff about Nibelheim in the original Final Fantasy VII didn't come into play until much later in the story. Visions of the Future. It's not just the past that Cloud has visions of during the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Throughout the game, he, and often some other characters, get sudden and fleeting glimpses of the future. This ties in with the Whispers, whom we'll be talking about in just a bit, but fans of the original Final Fantasy VII will surely have recognized extremely brief recreations of some truly iconic scenes from the game. Roche. Final Fantasy VII Remake introduces quite a few completely new characters, many of whom go on to have pretty important roles in the story. Motorcycle enthusiast Roche, nicknamed the Speed Demon, isn't as prominent or important as some of the other newcomers, but he does take center stage in one chapter during the early hours of the game. A third-class soldier, Roche is a man who loves speed, bikes, and thrills, and seems to really love duking it out against Cloud. It's likely that he'll be returning in sequels, but for now, we really don't know much else about him. Corneo's Trio. Don Corneo and the influence he exerts over Wall Market are plot points that are developed much better in the Final Fantasy VII Remake than they were in the original, and to that end, the game introduces several new characters. Don Corneo has 3 trusted advisors called the Trio, all of whom Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith have quite a few interactions with. There's Madam M, who runs a massage parlor in Wall Market. There's Chocobo Sam, who, as his name suggests, runs a Chocobo delivery service. And there's Andrea Rodea, the owner, proprietor, and lead dancer of the Honeybee Inn. Leslie Kyle. Another important new secondary character we get introduced to during the Wall Market section of the game is Leslie Kyle. He's not exactly new, since he was also featured in the novel Final Fantasy VII The Kids Are Alright, but though he wasn't in the original Final Fantasy VII, he is featured in the remake. He works under Don Corneo, but harbors a deep hatred for the man, due to a tragedy in his past involving the Don and his fiancée. He is the one who helps Cloud, Barret, and Tifa get to the top of the plate when they set out to rescue Aerith from Shinra headquarters. Shinra's Underground Lab. Final Fantasy VII Remake very convincingly established throughout its 30-plus hours that Shinra is an evil, evil corporation. And that's not just because they're literally sucking the life out of the planet, wage war on nations to fuel their businesses, or exude undue control over all spheres of life. No, they also have labs where they conduct horrible experiments on people and turn them into actual monsters. When Cloud, Barret, and Tifa return to the Sector 7 slums after the plate collapses to look for survivors, they fall into one of those labs. This lab, in particular, never existed in the original Final Fantasy VII. Jessie's expanded story. Jessie is one of several secondary characters who were present in the original Final Fantasy VII, but have been given significantly expanded roles in the remake. One chapter in particular sees Cloud, Jessie, Wedge, and Biggs heading plateside to help her secure a weaker bombing agent so that she can trigger a much more controlled explosive on their next bombing run. And during this chapter, we also learn new things about her past. For instance, we get to see her mother as well as her father, who we also learn was severely injured in an accident working for Shinra and has been in a vegetative state ever since. It is also possible that Jessie survived in the remake, as opposed to her fate in the original, because in one of the final scenes of the game, we're very pointedly shown her gloves and headband, along with some other things that we'll get to next, which might be implying that perhaps she made it out alive. Biggs is still alive. So in the scene where we see Jesse's gloves and headband, what's the very next thing that we see? Well, Biggs lying on a bed, recovering from his injuries. Yeah, as it turns out, Biggs is still alive. While he died in the original Final Fantasy VII when Shinra dropped the plate on the Sector 7 slums, in the remake he's somehow still alive and breathing, and will probably have more of a role to play in the future. Wedge is still alive. It's not just Biggs and possibly Jesse who have escaped certain death in the remake. Wedge, who also died in the original game during the plate's collapse, also survives the incident. While he does fall from the pillar like in the original, he's only gravely injured, and while he is still in the Sector 7 slums when the plate collapses, Cloud, Barret, and Tifa later go back for him and rescue him. He even shows up at the end during their infiltration of Shinra HQ to help them from the sidelines. That said, the Whispers do try to ensure that he once again falls to his death towards the end of the game, but we don't actually see him die on screen. His fate is very much still up in the air, but we're willing to bet he's still alive. A larger Avalanche. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Avalanche was a pretty ragtag group of anti-Shinra eco-terrorists. Barret, Tifa, Jesse, Wedge, and Biggs were basically it. In the remake, this group is basically just one cell of an entire rebellious organization. In fact, Barret's cell is something of an outcast within Avalanche, who view the actions of his team as a bit too extreme. Avalanche's Inside Man. Being a much larger group, Avalanche now also has a lot more resources to work with. That also means they have spies within Shinra itself. One such inside man is Mayor Domino himself. Domino was in the original game, but he had a very minor role. In the remake, his role is still pretty minor, but him being an inside man for Avalanche is a completely new element to the story. Though he was disillusioned with Shinra in the original Final Fantasy VII, he was never outright working against them as an Avalanche member. The Wutai Conspiracy. Shinra trying to drum up anti-Avalanche sentiments among the people of Midgar was something we saw in the original game too, but in the remake, it's a much more fleshed out and a much more central plot point. In fact, Shinra, wanting to go to war with Wutai, decides to use Avalanche as part of a ploy to promote anti-Wutai sentiments as well, by spreading false information that Avalanche are being backed by Wutai and that they are responsible for all of the bombings and the collapse of the Sector 7 plate. Whispers. Whispers are a completely new addition in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and probably also the biggest. Not only does their addition significantly alter how the game ends, it may also have major ripple effects on future events. These hooded ghostly apparitions are arbiters of fate, who ensure that the flow of destiny isn't changed, that everything plays out the way it was supposed to. Essentially, their job is to ensure that the events in Final Fantasy VII Remake do not deviate from the original game's events. It's all very meta. They intervene in the story at several points to make sure that things that are not supposed to happen don't happen, such as making sure that Barret doesn't die, even after he gets impaled by Sephiroth. Cloud and company do destroy the Whispers at the end, taking control of their own fate, and the implication is that the sequels are going to have a lot of changes to the narrative. Zack might still be alive. This is another major change, and it's very likely in here because of the Whispers. Final Fantasy VII Remake shows Zack's last stand against Shinra forces outside of Midgar, but while we've always known that as the moment that he dies, the remake changes that up, and he actually manages to survive and is seen heading towards Midgar with Cloud. Is it possible that by destroying the Whispers, Cloud and company might have actually been able to change the events in the past as well? More importantly, if Zack is still alive, what does that mean for Cloud and his backstory? Because Zack's death was a pretty crucial turning point for him that defined much of what came next in his life, so it'll be interesting to see how the sequel handles this. Sephiroth shows up early. Sephiroth was, of course, a major presence all throughout the original Final Fantasy VII, but he never actually made an appearance during its Midgar sections. In the remake, he does make an actual physical appearance. We first see him, or, well, a clone being controlled by him, in Shinra HQ, before Cloud fights the actual Sephiroth in the alternate dimension of the Whispers, and later at a place Sephiroth calls the Edge of Creation. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.